It was a bustling morning at the county courthouse, with people weaving in and out of the grand building, carrying their hopes, fears, and stories with them. The air was thick with tension, a mix of anticipation and dread that often accompanies a day in court. At the center of it all was Judge Richard Holman, a man known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense rulings. To some, he was a beacon of justice, a firm hand guiding the community. But to others, whispers followed him like shadows. Whispers about the way he seemed harsher on certain individuals, how his courtroom felt colder for those who didn't fit a particular mold. Seated in the back row of the courtroom that morning was Jamal Carter, a 17-year-old with bright eyes that carried the weight of years beyond his age. Dressed neatly in a simple button-up shirt and slacks, he sat quietly, clutching a folder close to his chest. He glanced around nervously, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. This wasn't how he had imagined stepping into this courtroom for the first time. Jamal wasn't here for any wrongdoing. In fact, he had spent weeks preparing for this day, excited about an opportunity that could shape his future. But as the minutes ticked by, he felt the weight of every glance thrown his way, the murmurs that trailed him as he walked in. He was used to it by now, the looks, the assumptions. But today, it stung just a little more. The sound of the gavel brought everyone to attention. Judge Holman entered the room with his usual air of authority, his black robe billowing as he took his seat. His piercing gaze scanned the courtroom, landing briefly on Jamal. A flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps even disdain, crossed his face before he quickly moved on. Next case, Holman barked, his voice echoing through the chamber. His tone was sharp, almost impatient, as if he had already decided the fate of whoever stood before him. Jamal rose from his seat, his legs feeling like lead. He stepped forward, clutching his folder tighter as he approached the bench. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, imagining every possible scenario. But nothing could have prepared him for the icy glare of Judge Holman. "And who are you?" Holman asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't even bother to hide the judgment in his tone, his eyes scanning Jamal from head to toe. Jamal swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "My name is Jamal Carter, sir," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I'm here." "I don't need a backstory," Holman interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "If you're here to waste my time, you can turn around and walk right out that door." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Jamal felt his cheeks flush with heat, but he stood his ground. "I'm here," he said firmly, "because I've been appointed as the new court director." For a moment, the room fell into stunned silence. Then, Holman let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You," he scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You've got to be kidding me." Jamal didn't flinch. He met the judge's gaze, his resolve unshaken. "Yes, sir. I was selected for this position, and I believe I'm more than qualified to handle the responsibilities." Holman's laughter died down, replaced by a cold, scrutinizing stare. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "Let me make something very clear, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low and threatening. "This courtroom is not a playground. I don't care what kind of strings you pull to get here, but I will not tolerate incompetence. Do you understand me?" Jamal nodded, his jaw tightening. "I understand, sir." Holman smirked, leaning back in his chair once more. "Good, because if you step 1 foot out of line, you won't just be out of this courtroom. You'll be out of career." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the exchange. Jamal turned and walked back to his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. He had expected resistance, but not like this. Still, he refused to let it deter him. He had worked too hard to let one man's prejudice derail his dreams. But as he sat down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Judge Holman wasn't just going to test him. He was going to challenge him every turn. And Jamal knew he had to be ready for whatever came next. Little did the judge know, his next lesson in humility was only moments away. The courtroom buzzed quietly after the exchange between Judge Holman and Jamal. Eyes darted between the two men, and hushed whispers filled the room. It wasn't every day that someone as young as Jamal found themselves in such a prominent position, especially under the watchful and often critical eye of someone like Judge Holman. For most, the courtroom was a place of order and justice, but today it felt like the air had grown heavier, the space charged with something unspoken. Jamal sat with his head held high, though his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the folder in his lap. He replayed the judge's words in his mind, each one laced with a thinly veiled disdain that stung more than he cared to admit. But Jamal was no stranger to this feeling. He had been underestimated for as long as he could remember. It wasn't new, it was fuel. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Jamal had learned early on that the world wasn't always kind to people like him. His mother, a single parent who worked long hours as a nurse, had instilled in him a relentless work ethic and the belief that education could open doors others might try to keep closed. Jamal had excelled in school, earning scholarships and accolades that proved his potential time and time again. Yet, despite his accomplishments, there were always those who questioned his place at the table, as if he had to constantly prove he belonged. The position of court director was no different. It was a role that required not only intelligence and organizational skill, but also the ability to navigate egos and power dynamics. When Jamal applied for the job, he knew it would be a long shot. But to his surprise, his qualifications and his vision for the court's future had impressed the hiring committee. They saw in him what he had always known he was capable of: leadership, innovation, and resilience. What they hadn't warned him about was the resistance he would face from within. Jamal had done his research on Judge Holman. The man was respected by some but feared by many. His reputation for being harsh and unyielding wasn't what worried Jamal. It was the rumors of bias, of an unwillingness to see beyond his own rigid worldview. Jamal had hoped that their professional relationship could begin with mutual respect. Instead, it had started with an icy wall of judgment. Jamal's thoughts were interrupted when the courtroom door creaked open. A woman in a tailored navy suit entered, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Her presence commanded attention, and the murmurs quickly subsided. This was Claire Bennett, the court administrator and someone Jamal had briefly met during the hiring process. She was known for being sharp, efficient, and fair, a stark contrast to Holman's gruff demeanor. "Judge Holman," Claire said as she approached the bench, her voice steady and professional. "May I have a word with you in chambers?" The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded, rising from his seat with an air of mild irritation. He cast one last glance at Jamal before following Claire out of the courtroom. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate slightly in their absence, but Jamal remained on edge. He knew the discussion was likely about him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be favorable. As the minutes ticked by, Jamal's mind wandered back to the folder in his hands. Inside were his plans, detailed outlines of initiatives he hoped to implement as court director. He had ideas to streamline case processing, improve accessibility for underprivileged communities, and foster a more inclusive environment within the courthouse. To him, this job wasn't just about running a system. It was about making a difference. But making a difference often meant facing resistance, and today was proof of that. He took a deep breath, reminding himself why he had fought so hard to be here. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "The road is tough, but every step you take forward matters." Jamal clenched his jaw, resolving to take that next step, no matter how challenging it might be. Meanwhile, in Judge Holman's chambers, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Claire stood with her arms crossed, her expression firm as she addressed the judge. "Richard," she began, dropping the formalities they usually maintained in public. "I know what you're thinking. I'm going to stop you right there." Holman leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of indifference. "Oh, really? And what am I thinking, Claire?" "You're questioning his qualifications. You're doubting his ability to do the job. And you're making it abundantly clear that you don't want him here," Claire said bluntly. "But let me remind you, Jamal Carter was chosen because he earned it. The committee saw his potential, and frankly, so do I." Holman scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. Potential doesn't run a courthouse, Claire. Experience does, and he has none. Everyone starts somewhere, she countered. Including you. Or have you forgotten that you weren't exactly welcomed with open arms when you first put on that robe? Holman's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Claire leaned forward, her tone softening slightly. Look, I know you take pride in this courthouse. You've dedicated years to upholding its reputation, but don't let your pride blind you to someone who could genuinely make it better. Give him a chance, Richard. That's all I'm asking. The judge stared at her for a long moment before finally nodding, though the tension in his jaw remained. Fine. He'll get his chance, but don't expect me to go easy on him. I wouldn't expect anything less, Claire said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. With that, she turned and left the chambers, leaving Holman alone with his thoughts. Back in the courtroom, Jamal's nerves were fraying. He had no idea what was being said behind closed doors, but he knew he couldn't let it distract him. He straightened his posture, glancing around the room at the faces watching him. Some were curious, others skeptical, and a few even seemed supportive. But no matter what they thought, Jamal knew he had a job to do. The door to the chambers opened, and Holman returned, his expression unreadable. He resumed his seat and glanced at Jamal, his gaze cold, but less overtly hostile than before. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. You may proceed with your duties, but let me make one thing clear. I'll be watching. Jamal met the judge's eyes, his resolve unwavering. Understood, Your Honor. As the session resumed, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a battlefield. The path ahead would be anything but smooth, but he was ready to face it. What he didn't know was just how quickly the stakes would rise and how the events of the coming days would challenge not only his skills, but also his very sense of justice. The courthouse felt like a maze of unspoken rules and silent judgments as Jamal began his first official day as court director. He walked the long hallways with purpose, his folder now tucked under his arm, trying to focus on the tasks ahead. The echoes of hurried footsteps and murmured conversations surrounded him, but he could feel the weight of eyes on his back. Whispers traveled quickly in places like this, and Jamal knew he was the subject of many. Jamal had spent the previous night reviewing court procedures, memorizing schedules, and preparing an agenda to present to the staff. He wanted to hit the ground running, to prove not just to himself, but to everyone watching that he belonged in this role. But the lingering tension with Judge Holman wasn't something he could simply ignore. The judge's words from the courtroom replayed in his mind, each syllable carrying an unspoken challenge. Jamal understood that his every move would be scrutinized, and he had no choice but to meet those expectations head-on. As he entered the administrative office, he was greeted by a mix of expressions. Some staff members offered polite smiles, while others barely acknowledged his presence. A middle-aged man named Carl, the head clerk, stepped forward with an air of professionalism. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Carl said, extending a hand. His tone was neutral, his handshake firm but brief. "Welcome aboard." "Thank you, Carl," Jamal replied, matching his professionalism. "I'm looking forward to working with everyone." Carl nodded, though his expression betrayed a hint of skepticism. "If there's anything you need, just let me know. We've got a full docket today, so it'll be a busy one." Jamal appreciated the offer, even if it felt perfunctory. He glanced around the room, noting the wary glances from a few of the clerks. He knew that respect wouldn't come easily. It would have to be earned. Throughout the morning, Jamal immersed himself in the workflow, reviewing case files and meeting with staff members to understand the courthouse's inner workings. He was struck by the inefficiencies in the system. Outdated filing methods, communication breakdowns, and an overall sense of disorganization. It was clear that change was needed, but Jamal also recognized that pushing too hard, too fast could backfire. As the day wore on, Jamal's interactions with Judge Holman were kept to a minimum, but the tension between them lingered like a storm cloud. Holman's cold demeanor was evident in every glance and curt response, and Jamal couldn't help but wonder if the judge was deliberately testing him. Later that afternoon, as Jamal reviewed a particularly complex case file, he noticed a discrepancy in the documents. A key piece of evidence seemed to be missing, and the timeline of events didn't quite add up. Concerned, he decided to bring it to Carl's attention. "Carl," Jamal began, approaching the clerk's desk. "I was reviewing the files for the Parker case. I noticed something odd. The evidence log references a statement that isn't included in the file. Do you know what happened to it?" Carl frowned, glancing at the file Jamal held. "That's strange," he muttered, taking the folder and flipping through its contents. "I don't recall seeing anything missing when we processed it." Jamal leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "It's important that everything's accounted for. If something got misplaced or overlooked, it could impact the case." Carl nodded, his expression growing serious. "I'll look into it. Thanks for catching that." As Jamal returned to his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that the missing document was more than just a simple oversight. The case itself was high profile, involving allegations of corruption within a local business. It was the kind of case that attracted attention and scrutiny. That evening, Jamal stayed late, combing through additional files and taking notes on areas where the system seemed to falter. As the hours ticked by, the courthouse grew quieter, the bustling activity of the day giving way to an eerie stillness. The sound of his pen scratching against paper was the only noise in the empty office. He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't hear the door open behind him. When he finally looked up, he saw Judge Holman standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Burning the midnight oil already, Carter?" Holman asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Jamal straightened in his seat, setting his pen down. "Just trying to get ahead, Your Honor. There's a lot to take in." Holman stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the scattered papers on Jamal's desk. "Ambition is admirable, but it can also be dangerous if it's not tempered by experience." Jamal unmet the judge's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I believe preparation is just as important as experience, sir. I want to make sure I'm fully equipped to handle this role." Holman smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see if that preparation holds up under pressure." The judge turned to leave, but paused at the door. "One more thing," he said without looking back. "Be careful where you dig, Carter. Not everything needs uncovering." Jamal watched as Holman disappeared down the hallway, his words hanging heavily in the air. It wasn't just a warning. It felt like a threat. And it only deepened Jamal's suspicion that there was more going on beneath the surface than he realized. The following day, Jamal received a call from Claire Bennett. Her tone was warm but laced with urgency. "Jamal, I heard you've been looking into the Parker case. I think we need to talk." Jamal agreed to meet her in her office later that afternoon. When he arrived, Claire wasted no time getting to the point. "I don't know what you found, but you need to tread carefully," she said, leaning forward in her chair. "The Parker case has a lot of eyes on it, and not all of them are friendly." "I noticed a missing document in the evidence log," Jamal explained. "It could be nothing, but if it's intentional." Claire held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "If it's intentional, then you're stepping into dangerous territory. There are people who don't want that case to see the light of day, and they'll do whatever it takes to bury it." Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying someone in this courthouse is involved?" "I'm saying you need to be smart about how you proceed," Claire said firmly. "You've got the potential to do great things here, Jamal. Don't let this case derail your future." Jamal nodded, though his mind was racing. The Parker case was no longer just a file on his desk. It was a minefield. And with Judge Holman's cryptic warning still fresh in his mind, Jamal realized he was in far deeper than he had anticipated. But he wasn't about to back down. If there was something corrupt happening within the courthouse, he couldn't ignore it. The stakes were rising, and Jamal was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost.